Welcome to the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, a podcast for business owners sharing the latest news and tips about customs clearance and freight forwarding. Welcome to episode 10 of the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, Customs Broker. In this episode, we'll be discussing the topic of excavators, tractors, forklifts, and walkie stackers. So now let's begin with an overview. Peter, can you share what are some of the common types of heavy equipment imported to Australia, such as excavators, tractors, forklifts, and walkie stackers?
So we do regularly see importers importing excavators, tractors, forklifts, and walkie stackers. Whether some of these items are for their personal use on their property or whether they are commercial business goods, we do have importers and customers who are a blend of both, whether that's an individual importer or a business. And we do get this question a lot where people ask, do I have to be a business to import? And it's probably a good spot for me to say that anybody can import goods to Australia, whether they are an individual or a business. The fees are the same, so there's no issues there. So importers will, depending on what they're purchasing, depending on how big their shipment is, some of their goods may arrive as sea freight LCL, which is less than a container load, which means that their goods will be sharing space with other people's goods in a shipping container traveling to Australia. Whereas other importers will have a FCL, a full container load of goods from one supplier going to one importer, and everything inside that container is their goods. Commonly, and in recent time, we're seeing that a lot of importers that do import FCLs are actually importing and purchasing the shipping container. So I can expand on that later, but we do find that if an importer does have let's say, a rural property and they want to import a tractor and they're going to import the attachments for that tractor, they do say to themselves, why not purchase a shipping container from overseas? And then when the goods arrive at their rural property and the goods have been unpacked, then they can use that shipping container as their storage shed for their tractor, or they can use it as their workshop. But anyway, that's just a side note that we do see a lot of FCL importers who import these type of goods actually purchase the shipping container as well.
Now, before purchasing these types of equipment from overseas, what important factors should importers consider to ensure a smooth import process?
The earlier the better is the key. So we do have different importers, different situations, different scenarios. We do have importers who will contact us before they even pay a deposit on the goods. We have other importers who may have paid for the goods and the goods are about to depart for Australia. And then we then have other importers who will actually call us and say their goods have arrived and they now need a customs broker to process the LCL or the FCL shipment quickly because they need to avoid storage cost. And if we are involved in the process at an early stage, that allows us to liaise with the importer and the overseas supplier together. And then we advise the overseas supplier of all of the paperwork that we need. And we are able to check the paperwork to make sure that it's accurate, make sure that the cargo is going to arrive at the right port. And I know that can sound like it never happens, or there's no confusion about where cargo arrives. But many a time, cargo destined for Sydney could arrive in Brisbane, or cargo destined for Melbourne can arrive at another port. So it does happen where people overseas think that one location is close to another location. So would we would look at all the paperwork, we'd make sure it's accurate, such things as where is the cargo going to be discharged, and we would also be looking for some sort of insurance certificate to make sure that the goods are insured between point A and point B.
What other preparations should importers make before their equipment is shipped to Australia to avoid any complications upon arrival?
Every importation to the country is like a puzzle, is like a jigsaw puzzle, if I can use that analogy. And the importer has done the most difficult part of the process. They have went and found their supplier that they want to buy the goods from, and that is the hardest part, because one, the importer and the supplier don't know each other. The importer is unsure, if I give this person money, will I actually receive my goods? So there is risk on both parts of the coin. So both sides of the coin, both people have issues, and they need to have those the confidence met. Then once that hardest part has occurred, then a deposit will be made. Then the overseas supplier will start to manufacture the goods if the goods are not ready to be shipped straight away. And then, as I mentioned, if the customs broker is involved early, then the way we do things is we email that supplier and the importer, ask for these documents, and there'll be a minimum of 6 to 8 documents that we need. We check them, we approve them. The goods are then packaged. The goods will either then travel to the country, sharing space with other people's goods, or they will be shipped to the country in one shipping container for the importer. But there are various government departments that need to be satisfied. So amongst this puzzle, amongst this jigsaw, we have at least 3 government departments who will need to be satisfied, and one of them is the Australian Border Force. The second one is the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, which I refer to as agriculture. And then the third government department is the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, and I'll refer to them as the environment.
Now, once the goods arrive in Australia, what are the options for collecting LCL cargo from the sea freight depot, and what is the process for delivering FCL cargo to the commercial address?
So if we talk about the LCL cargo scenario, the importer has goods arriving into the country. They don't have enough goods that will fill a whole shipping container. So the Australian freight forwarder will go and collect the whole shipping container from the wharf, take it to their unpack depot. Everybody's cargo is then separated, and then everybody will then receive an email notification advising that the goods are available for collection. And then every importer has 3 business days to go and collect the goods. And then after that time, the unpack depot will charge storage, which will be based on how large, how many cubic meters that shipment actually is. So the importer will be able to either attend to the unpack depot and pick up the LCL cargo themselves, or we could collect the cargo from the LCL depot and then deliver the goods to the importer's commercial premise. But if I now talk about the FCL scenario, the FCL will arrive at the wharf, and then the importer will need to, or maybe I should say the importer should, rely upon their customs broker to collect that container from the wharf and then deliver that container to the importer's commercial premise or to the importer's rural property, place the container onto the ground, and then the importer will then unpack that container. The main difference between LCL and FCL is the importer is responsible for having that FCL full container load collected from the wharf. The importer is responsible for unpacking that FCL, and the importer is responsible to have that FCL returned back to the wharf as quickly as possible, because the shipping line who owns the shipping container is and will start a clock as soon as the vessel arrives at the wharf. So the vessel arrives at the wharf and the clock starts, and the shipping line will allow possibly 7 to 10 calendar days before they will charge rent or detention for that FCL. So if it takes a day or two to come off the boat, and then if it then takes time to then deliver the goods to the importer, then if it takes another 2 days for the importer to unpack that container, and then more time to then return that container back to the wharf, you can see that it doesn't take long for 7 to 10 days to evaporate. So LCL and FCL are two different types of projects, but as you can see, the FCL scenario puts much more responsibility on the importer, and the importer has more clocks ticking. And when clocks are ticking, that means somebody is going to be wanting compensation, rent, detention, or a storage fee paid.
Now, what specific issues does the Australian Border Force or ABF focus on regarding this type of equipment, such as asbestos and related test reports and certificates?
When an importer is importing these type of items, excavators, tractors, forklifts, walkie stackers, the first government department that is concerned is the Australian Border Force. And the main issue that we see during our day-to-day business operations is that the ABF is concerned about asbestos, and they're concerned about what assurances the overseas supplier has provided to the Australian importer to state, to verify, to prove that there is no asbestos components in these goods. And usually, or in previous time, asbestos has been found in such items like brake pads, brake linings, gaskets, and so the ABF can ask the Australian importer to provide test reports or test certificates to prove that these goods do not contain asbestos. If the overseas supplier has not provided the Australian importer with these test reports or test certificates to satisfy the Australian Border Force, then the Australian Border Force can hold the cargo and instruct the importer to source a NATA approved asbestos testing company to take samples to prove that there are no asbestos components in the goods. So if these goods are held and if these goods have to be sampled, then the time that the goods are at the unpacked depot is going to cost the importer money. So it is important that the overseas supplier can provide test reports to satisfy the ABF.
Now, what are the key concerns of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, or the DAF, when it comes to importing pre-used equipment?
With our company, we don't work with, and we don't even encourage people to import pre-used or pre-owned machinery, but new machinery, new excavators, new tractors, new forklifts that come to the country do need to have supporting documentation which satisfies agriculture about the goods being new and not pre-used. And then once agriculture has seen these assurances, which are written and signed by the overseas supplier, then agriculture is generally satisfied, and then that is the second government department that we are able to receive release from.
How does the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, or the DCEEW, regulate items like air conditioners in imported tractors?
So this third government department, which I'll refer to as the Environment Department, they are concerned with ozone depleting gases, ODGs, and it is common for the tractor to have an air conditioner installed. Therefore, we always ask the overseas supplier to provide information about what refrigerant gas has been used to charge the air conditioner. There are a list of ODGs that are not permitted in Australia, and it's important that this issue, this topic is addressed early, because as you can see, we have three government departments to deal with. The ABF is also concerned about ozone depleting gases. So if we are able to satisfy these three government departments, then the cargo will be able to be released quickly and the importer can receive the goods sooner rather than later.
Now, can you share some real world examples or case studies, such as the importation of walkie stackers in Melbourne, the excavator that was imported in Brisbane, and the tractor with the attachments that was imported to Hobart that had no issues?
So whenever I give some case studies, I usually try to find some horror stories, because horror stories always seem more interesting. But on today's topic, I have three case studies, and thankfully there are no horror stories. So case study number one, we had an importer import walkie stackers. The cargo was LCL, less than a container load. We were able to liaise with the Melbourne-based importer and their overseas supplier early in the stage, early in the process, and we received all of the paperwork before the goods departed from overseas, and the goods had no hiccups or delays, and we delivered the walkie stackers to the importer. The only thing that did go wrong, or maybe was to be expected, is that the walkie stackers were packaged in a plywood case. And if you think about how many times LCL cargo is touched, it's impossible for timber packaging to have some sort of damage. So the goods originated from overseas, they're touched with a forklift. The goods are packed inside a shipping container, they're touched with a forklift. The goods are unpacked from the shipping container in Melbourne, they're touched with a forklift. The goods are then loaded onto a truck to be taken to the importer's premise. They've been touched by a forklift. So the amount of times that LCL cargo is touched, there's going to be some sort of damage. It doesn't happen all the time, but in this case, it was just plywood, timber, packaging damage, and the goods were not affected, so everybody was happy. With the case study number 2, we had an importer who was importing an excavator. The importer was an individual, so they weren't a business. They imported the excavator so that they could use this on their property. Again, we were able to liaise with the importer supplier overseas, and we received all of the paperwork before the goods departed. And this importer arranged their own transport from the unpacked depot through to their property. And when we followed up with the importer, there were no issues, and the importer found the experience to be stress-free. So there was no hassles with number 2. And case study number 3, this importer was a individual. They imported a tractor, they imported the attachments, so they imported the bucket and other attachments that they would use with the tractor. They also imported the shipping container. They purchased the shipping container, so we delivered the whole shipping container to this individual importer's premise, and then placed the container onto the ground, and then the importer had their goods and their shipping container on their property. There were no issues with this container, and all these items were new, and we were able to satisfy those 3 government departments, and there was no hassles, no issues to report on that one.
Now, how can Platinum Freight assist in customs clearing excavators, tractors, forklifts, and walkie stackers at any location in Australia?
So as a customs broker, we regularly customs clear cargo that arrives at various ports in Australia, as I've just mentioned. So we had one customer in Melbourne, one customer in Brisbane, and another customer in Hobart. So irrespective of where the importer is, and irrespective of where we are located, we can customs clear any cargo that arrives at any wharf or any port in Australia. And just as a side note, this week we customs cleared a full container load that arrived in Dampier. And so every day we have cargo arriving at different ports or different wharves, and we're able to customs clear that cargo. And we always prefer to customs clear the cargo before it arrives. We understand that first-time importers don't always know the process, and they usually find out that they need a customs broker at the very end of the journey. Some importers do find out at an earlier stage that they need a customs broker, and that's always the best stage to be at. But we just deal with what we are given, and we just work with what we have, and we just make the task and the customs clearance as stress-free as we possibly can, so that the importer can receive their cargo quickly and without various people having clocks ticking, wishing to charge extra fees for their imported cargo.
Now, finally, are there any additional tips or best practices that you can share for ensuring the smooth importation of heavy equipment and avoiding some of those common pitfalls?
As I reflect back on all of the customs clearances that I have personally processed over the last 26 years, I always believe that the earlier that a customs broker is involved, that is the best time to iron out, address any issues. So we know the issues that are going to occur, and our goal is always to iron out those issues before the goods arrive into the country. The most One of the most common issues though, and I talk about it regularly, is that importers don't always have adequate or any insurance coverage on the goods that they import to the country. And insurance is an important factor, because if the goods are not insured and an issue occurs, if the goods are lost, stolen, damaged, or if the goods do fall off the vessel en route to Australia, then the importer has no coverage, and $10,000, $20,000 worth of cargo, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cargo falling off a boat is a great risk. And for such a small cost, for such a small investment, I, for me, I always want to make sure, I want to see that the cargo has been insured from point A to point B.
Thanks for sharing your insights and tips, Peter. Now, to learn more about customs clearance and freight management services, visit platinumfreight.com.au.